The concert hall was packed with people that cold evening in Vienna. It was the year 1798, and everyone who mattered in the music world was there. They sat in their fancy clothes waiting to hear the young composer play. Marcus Heilmann was only 28 years old, but he was already famous. For the past 5 years, his music had been played in the greatest halls across Europe. People called him a genius. They said he was the future of music. Marcus stood backstage, his hands shaking. He wiped his palms on his coat again and again. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for months now, but tonight it felt worse than ever. He could hear a ringing sound in his ears. It never stopped. Day and night it was always there, but it was more than just ringing. Sounds were becoming strange. When people spoke to him, their voices sounded like they were underwater. When he played the piano, the notes seemed far away. A man in a dark coat came to get him. It was time. Marcus walked onto the stage. The audience clapped. He could see their hands moving, but the sound seemed muffled and distant. He sat down at the piano. His heart was beating so fast he thought everyone could hear it. He looked out at the crowd. In the front row he saw Herr Gottfried Schmidt. Schmidt was the most important music critic in all of Vienna. One good review from him could make a career. One bad review could end it. Marcus had received many good reviews from Schmidt in the past. The critic had written that Marcus was brilliant. He had said that Marcus understood music better than composers twice his age. But that was 2 years ago. Things were different now. Marcus placed his fingers on the keys. He took a deep breath and began to play. The piece was one he had written himself. He knew every note by heart. He had practiced it hundreds of times, but something was terribly wrong. The notes that came from the piano did not sound right. They seemed too loud in some places and too soft in others. He could not hear the balance. He pressed the keys harder, trying to hear better. His timing was off. Notes that should flow smoothly sounded choppy and disconnected. In the audience, people began to shift in their seats. Some whispered to each other. Marcus saw Schmidt lean over to speak to the man sitting next to him. The critic's face showed concern. Or was it disappointment? Marcus could not tell. He tried to focus on the music, but panic was rising in his chest. His fingers stumbled over passages he had played perfectly 100 times before. The piece was supposed to last 15 minutes. It felt like hours. Finally, it was over. Marcus stood up and bowed. The audience clapped. But it was not the enthusiastic applause he was used to. It was polite, restrained. The kind of clapping people do when they feel sorry for someone. Marcus walked off the stage as quickly as he could. Backstage, no one knew what to say to him. The concert manager, Herr Friedrich, patted him on the shoulder. "Perhaps you were nervous," Friedrich said kindly. "It happens to everyone sometimes." But Marcus knew it was not nerves. He had performed in front of kings and queens. He had played for audiences of thousands. He was never nervous. Marcus left the concert hall through the back door. He did not want to face anyone. He walked through the dark streets of Vienna alone. The ringing in his ears seemed louder now. Or maybe it was just that everything else seemed quieter. He had been pretending for months that nothing was wrong. He had been making excuses. He told himself the ringing would go away. He told himself it was just stress or tiredness. But he could not pretend anymore. When Marcus was a boy, music had saved his life. His family had been poor. His father had lost his job when Marcus was only 7 years old. There was never enough food. Never enough money for warm clothes in winter. But Marcus had music. A kind teacher had given him free piano lessons. When Marcus played, he forgot about being hungry. He forgot about being cold. Music was the one beautiful thing in his difficult life. By the time he was 15, Marcus was playing in local concerts. By 18, he was studying with the best teachers in Vienna. By 23, he was composing his own works. Music had lifted him out of poverty. It had given him a life he never dreamed possible. And now it seemed music was being taken away from him. The next morning, Marcus stayed in bed late. He did not want to face the day. He knew what was coming. Around noon, there was a knock at his door. It was his housekeeper, Frau Weber. She was an older woman who had worked for Marcus for 3 years. She was kind and motherly, always making sure he ate properly and got enough rest. "Herr Heilmann," she said gently, "I am sorry, but I think you should see this." She handed him a newspaper. Marcus took it with trembling hands. He found the music review section. There, in bold letters, was Schmidt's review of last night's concert. Marcus read slowly. Each word felt like a knife. Schmidt wrote that the performance had been disappointing and confused. He said that Marcus seemed to have lost his gift. He suggested that perhaps Marcus had been overworked, or that his talent had been overpraised from the start. The final line was the worst. Perhaps it is time for younger, fresher talents to take the stage. Herr Heilmann's time in the spotlight appears to be over. Marcus set down the paper. He felt numb. Frau Weber sat down beside him. One bad review does not mean anything, she said. But they both knew that was not true. Schmidt's words carried enormous weight. Other critics would read this review. Concert halls would hear about it. Within days, everyone in Vienna's music world would know that Marcus Heilmann had failed. Over the next few weeks, everything Marcus feared came true. Concerts that had been scheduled were quietly canceled. Students who had begged to study with him suddenly had other commitments. Invitations to parties and musical gatherings stopped coming. It was as if Marcus had become invisible. The city that had loved him now turned its back on him. Marcus spent his days alone in his small apartment. He had 3 rooms above a bakery on a quiet street. His sitting room was filled with books about music theory. His bedroom was simple, just a bed and a wardrobe. But his study was his sanctuary. It had a piano, a desk covered with manuscript paper, and shelves full of his compositions. Marcus sat at his desk and looked at the papers scattered across it. For the past 2 years, he had been working on a symphony. It was his most ambitious project yet. A symphony was not like the short piano pieces he usually wrote. It was a massive work for a full orchestra, with 4 separate movements that could last nearly an hour. Marcus had filled page after page with notes for violins, cellos, horns, flutes, and dozens of other instruments. But the symphony was not finished. He had completed only 3 of the 4 movements. The final movement existed only as scattered ideas and unconnected themes. For 2 years, Marcus had been struggling with this last movement. He knew what he wanted it to express. He wanted it to capture something he could not put into words. He wanted it to show both struggle and triumph, darkness and light, despair and hope. But he could not figure out how to write it. And now, with his hearing fading, it seemed impossible. Marcus picked up one of the manuscript pages. The notes seemed to swim before his eyes. How could he finish a symphony when he could barely hear the piano? How could he write for an entire orchestra when he could not even judge the balance of 2 instruments playing together? It was hopeless. He should give up. He should find some other way to make a living. Maybe he could teach music theory to children who did not care about it. Maybe he could copy music for other composers. Maybe he could leave Vienna entirely and go somewhere no one knew his name. But even as these thoughts ran through his mind, Marcus knew he could not give up. Music was not just his career. It was who he was. From the time he was a small boy, music had been the language he spoke best. Other people used words to express themselves. Marcus used notes and melodies and harmonies. Taking music away from him would be like taking away his voice, or worse, like taking away his soul. Marcus made a decision. He would finish the symphony. He did not know if anyone would ever hear it. He did not know if it would be any good. But he would finish it, he had to. It was the only way to prove to himself that he was still alive, still capable, still himself. The next morning, Marcus went to see a doctor. The doctor was an old man named Dr. Brenner, who had treated musicians for 40 years. Marcus sat in the examination room and explained what was happening. The ringing, the muffled sounds, the way music sounded wrong. Dr. Brenner examined Marcus's ears carefully. He asked many questions. How long had this been happening? Did it hurt? Was it worse in one ear than the other? Could Marcus still hear some things better than others? Marcus answered as best he could. Finally, Dr. Brenner sat back in his chair and sighed. I am sorry, Herr Heilmann, the doctor said. I have seen this condition before in other musicians. I do not know what causes it. There is no cure that I know of. Your hearing will likely continue to deteriorate. You may lose it entirely, or you may keep some hearing. There is no way to know. Marcus felt like the room was spinning. How long? He asked. His voice sounded strange in his own ears. Months. Years. I cannot say for certain. Every case is different. Marcus left the doctor's office in a daze. He walked through the streets of Vienna without seeing where he was going. People passed him by. Carriages rolled past. Somewhere church bells were ringing. Marcus could hear them only faintly, as if they were very far away. He found himself standing on a bridge over the river. He watched the water flowing beneath him. It was dark and cold. For a moment, Marcus thought how easy it would be to simply let go, to give up, to end the fear and the uncertainty and the loss. But then he thought of the unfinished symphony sitting on his desk. He thought of the music still inside him, waiting to come out. He thought of that 7-year-old boy playing piano in a cold room, finding joy in something beautiful even when everything else was hard. Marcus turned away from the bridge and walked home. When he got there, he went straight to his study. He lit candles even though it was still afternoon. He sat at his desk and pulled out the manuscript of his symphony. He looked at the blank pages that would become the fourth movement. And then, slowly, carefully, he began to write. He did not know if what he was writing was good. He could barely hear the notes in his head anymore. But he wrote anyway. He used everything he had learned in 20 years of studying music. He used his knowledge of how notes related to each other mathematically. He used his memory of how certain combinations of instruments sounded. He wrote from his heart instead of his ears. Hours passed. The candles burned down. Frau Weber knocked on the door to bring him dinner. But Marcus did not answer. He was lost in the music. For the first time in months, he felt like himself again. Not the famous composer that Vienna had celebrated. Not the failure that the critics had mocked. Just Marcus. Just a man writing music because he had to. Because it was the only thing he knew how to do. When he finally stopped writing, it was past midnight. His hand ached from holding the pen. His eyes were tired from working by candlelight. But he had written 8 pages. 8 pages of a symphony that might never be played. 8 pages that proved he was still a composer, still an artist, still alive. Marcus looked at what he had written. He could not hear it in his mind the way he used to. But he could see the patterns in the notes. He could see the structure, and somehow deep inside he knew it was right. This music was different from anything he had written before. It was rawer, more emotional, less pretty and more powerful. Marcus went to bed that night not with hope exactly, but with purpose. He did not know if his hearing would return. He did not know if he would ever perform in public again. He did not know if anyone would ever hear his symphony. But he knew what he had to do. He had to keep writing. He had to finish this work. Not for the critics. Not for the audiences. Not even for himself, really. He had to finish it because the music demanded to exist. And Marcus was the only one who could bring it into the world. Outside his window, Vienna slept. In the distance, a church clock struck 1. Marcus heard it only faintly, more a feeling than a sound. He closed his eyes and let sleep take him. Tomorrow he would write more. And the day after that. And the day after that, until the symphony was complete or his hearing was gone entirely. Whichever came first, the critics had laughed. The city had turned away. But Marcus Heilmann was not finished yet. His greatest work was still waiting to be born. And nothing, not even silence, would stop him from bringing it into the world. Winter came to Vienna, and with it came the cold that seeped through the walls of Marcus's small apartment. He barely noticed. Day after day he sat at his desk, writing music that he could no longer properly hear. His world had become very small. It consisted of his 3 rooms, his piano, and the growing stack of manuscript pages. Frau Weber worried about him. She came every morning to clean and bring him food. She watched him grow thinner. She saw the dark circles under his eyes from too many late nights working by candlelight. She saw the ink stains on his fingers that never washed away. But she also saw something else. She saw determination in his eyes that had not been there before. "You need to eat more, Herr Heilmann," she would say, bringing him soup or bread. Marcus would nod and thank her, but often the food sat untouched on his desk, going cold while he worked. The symphony was slowly taking shape. Marcus worked on the 4th movement every day, but he also went back to revise the first 3 movements. Everything sounded different now that he could barely hear. Or maybe he was different. He crossed out passages that he had thought were perfect. He added new sections that came from somewhere deep inside him. The music was becoming something unexpected, something he had never written before. Marcus developed new ways of working. Since he could not trust his ears anymore, he had to trust other things. He spent hours studying the mathematical relationships between notes. Music was not just art, it was also mathematics. Every note had a frequency. Every harmony was a mathematical ratio. Marcus began to write music more like a mathematician than a traditional composer. But that was not enough. Music was not just mathematics either. It had to have feeling. It had to touch the heart. So Marcus found another way. He began to feel music through his body instead of his ears. When he played the piano, he placed his hands flat on the wooden case. He could feel the vibrations. Different notes made different vibrations. High notes felt quick and light. Low notes felt slow and deep. He learned to sense the music through his fingertips. Sometimes Marcus would lie down on the floor while playing the piano. The vibrations would travel through the floorboards into his body. He could feel the bass notes in his chest. He could feel the rhythm in his bones. It was a strange way to experience music, but it worked. Marcus was learning a new language. The language of music that lived in the body instead of the ears. Months passed. Marcus spoke to almost no one except Frau Weber. He stopped going out. He stopped reading newspapers. He stopped caring what anyone in Vienna thought about him. The outside world faded away. There was only the music. One day in early spring, there was an unexpected knock at his door. Marcus answered it reluctantly. Standing there was Count Wilhelm von Esterwald. The Count was a wealthy man in his 50s who loved music. Years ago, when Marcus was just starting his career, the Count had been his patron. He had given Marcus money to live on while he composed. He had introduced Marcus to important people. In many ways, the Count had made Marcus's career possible. Marcus had not seen the Count in almost a year. He was embarrassed to have the Count see him now. Marcus knew he looked terrible. He had not cut his hair in months. His clothes were old and ink-stained. His apartment was messy with papers everywhere. "Marcus," the Count said warmly, "I have been worried about you. May I come in?" Marcus wanted to say no, but he could not be rude to the Count. He stepped aside and let him enter. The Count looked around the apartment. He saw the stacks of manuscript paper. He saw the meager furniture. He saw how Marcus was living. They sat down. The Count spoke, but Marcus had to ask him to repeat things. It was getting harder to understand speech. The Count noticed this. His expression changed from concern to understanding. "Marcus," the Count said slowly and clearly, "what has happened to you?" Marcus had been keeping his secret for so long. He had not told anyone except Dr. Brenner about his hearing. But sitting there with the Count, the man who had believed in him when no one else did, Marcus felt the words come out. "I am going deaf, Wilhelm," Marcus said. His voice was quiet. "It started over a year ago. It has been getting worse. Soon I may not hear anything at all." The Count sat back in his chair. He looked shocked. For a long moment he said nothing. Marcus waited for pity. He waited for the Count to make excuses and leave. He waited for another person to turn away from him, but the Count surprised him. "Does anyone else know?" he asked. "My doctor, my housekeeper, and now you. And yet you are still composing?" Marcus nodded toward the desk. "I am finishing my symphony, the one I started 3 years ago. I do not know if it is any good. I can barely hear it anymore, but I have to finish it." The Count stood up and walked to the desk. He picked up some of the manuscript pages. He could read music, though he could not play. He studied the notes carefully. He was quiet for a long time. Marcus watched him nervously. Finally, the Count set down the papers and turned to Marcus. "This is different from your other work," the Count said. "It is bolder, more powerful, less concerned with being pretty. Is that bad?" Marcus asked. "No," the Count said slowly. "No, I think it might be exactly what makes it great. Marcus, you need to have this performed." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Who would perform it? The whole city thinks I am finished. No one will hire me. No conductor will touch my work. I will hire the orchestra," the Count said. "I will pay for everything. We will have a private performance, just for friends and patrons who appreciate serious music." Marcus shook his head. "I cannot conduct it. I cannot hear the orchestra. It would be a disaster. Then we will find someone else to conduct. But Marcus, this music needs to be heard. You cannot let it die in this room." They talked for hours. Marcus explained all his fears. He was afraid of another public failure. He was afraid the music would sound wrong when a real orchestra played it. He was afraid people would laugh. Most of all, he was afraid that his deafness had made him incapable of writing good music anymore. But the Count was persistent. "You have always been brave," he said to Marcus. "You came from nothing and became one of Vienna's greatest composers. You cannot stop being brave now. This symphony deserves to live. Let me help you bring it into the world." Finally, Marcus agreed. But first, he said he had to finish the fourth movement. The Count promised to return in 3 months. That would give Marcus time to complete the work. Then they would begin rehearsals. After the Count left, Marcus sat alone in his study. He felt scared and excited at the same time. For months he had been writing just for himself. He had not thought anyone would ever hear this music. Now it might actually be performed. The thought was terrifying. Marcus threw himself into his work with renewed energy. He wrote every day from morning until night. The fourth movement slowly came together. It was unlike anything in the first 3 movements. Where they had been complex and intellectual, the fourth movement was pure emotion. It was chaos and order fighting each other. It was despair and hope mixed together. It was everything Marcus felt about his life, his art, and his struggle against silence. Frau Weber saw the change in him. He ate more. He slept better. He seemed to have a purpose again. "It is good to see you like this," she told him one morning. "You had become like a ghost." "I am still scared," Marcus admitted to her. "What if the symphony is terrible? What if I have been fooling myself?" "Then at least you will know," Frau Weber said wisely. "Not knowing is worse than knowing. And besides, I do not think you have been fooling yourself. I see how hard you work. I see how much this means to you. That cannot be for nothing." Marcus hoped she was right. 3 months later, the fourth movement was complete. Marcus looked at the finished symphony. It was over 200 pages of orchestral music. Every instrument in a full orchestra had its own part: violins and violas, cellos and basses, flutes and oboes and clarinets, trumpets and horns, timpani and drums. It was massive and complex and ambitious, and Marcus had written it almost entirely while deaf. The Count returned as promised. He brought good news. He had hired the Imperial Court Orchestra, the finest musicians in Vienna. They would begin rehearsals in 2 weeks. A young conductor named Hans Richter had agreed to lead the performance. Richter was talented and open-minded, willing to work with Marcus despite his reputation. But there was other news too. News that worried Marcus. Word had spread about the performance. It was supposed to be a small private concert, but now other people wanted to attend. Music critics had heard about it. Important people in Vienna's cultural world had asked for invitations. The Count had not been able to say no to all of them. "Herr Schmidt will be there," the Count admitted, the critic who wrote the bad review. "I could not refuse him without seeming suspicious. I am sorry, Marcus." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Schmidt would be there. The man who had destroyed his career with a few words. The man who had called him finished. Marcus wanted to cancel everything, but it was too late now. The orchestra was hired, the concert hall was reserved. People were expecting a performance. "It will be all right," the Count said, though he did not sound completely certain. "The music will speak for itself." The first rehearsal was set for Monday morning. Marcus did not sleep the night before. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ringing in his ears that never stopped. He thought about all the things that could go wrong. The orchestra might not understand his music. The conductor might not interpret it correctly. The balance between instruments might be completely wrong. He would be standing there, unable to hear properly, unable to fix anything. When morning came, Marcus dressed in his best clothes. He gathered the orchestral parts he had copied out by hand. Each musician needed their own part, showing just what they were supposed to play. It had taken Marcus weeks to copy everything out perfectly. He put all the papers in a leather case and walked to the concert hall. The hall was grand, with high ceilings and excellent acoustics. The orchestra members were already there, unpacking their instruments. Marcus recognized some of them. These were the same musicians who had played his earlier works years ago, when he was successful. He wondered what they thought of him now. The conductor, Richter, came over to greet Marcus. He was young, only 25, with bright eyes and an enthusiastic manner. "Herr Heilmann," he said, "I am honored to conduct your work. I have studied the score. It is very unusual, very bold. Is that your way of saying it is strange? Marcus asked. Richter smiled. No. It is my way of saying it is original. I have never seen music written quite like this. Marcus gave each musician their part. They began to look at the music, and he saw confusion on many faces. The notes he had written were difficult. The rhythms were complex. The dynamics changed dramatically, going from very soft to very loud in unusual ways. The concertmaster, a violinist named Josef Kramer, raised his hand. Herr Heilmann, he called out. These markings you have written, are you certain this is correct? In the second movement, you have the violins playing fortissimo while the flutes play pianissimo. They will not balance. Marcus had expected this. Yes, he said. That is what I want. Trust me. Kramer looked doubtful but said nothing more. The orchestra tuned their instruments. Marcus stood to the side. Richter raised his baton, and the rehearsal began. From the very first notes, Marcus knew there was a problem. He could see the musicians playing. He could see Richter conducting, but he could barely hear what they were producing. The sound reached him as if from far away, muffled and unclear. He could not tell if they were playing correctly. He could not judge the balance. He could not hear the details. After the first movement, Richter stopped the orchestra. Herr Heilmann, he said, could you come listen from the audience seats? The acoustics are better there. Marcus walked out into the hall and sat in the middle section. The orchestra played the first movement again. It was slightly better, but Marcus still could not hear properly. He could catch glimpses of the music, brief moments where a phrase came through clearly. But mostly it was just a jumble of muffled sound. When they finished, everyone looked at Marcus, waiting for his notes. He had pages of things he wanted to say, corrections and adjustments. But how could he make corrections when he could barely hear? He stood up and walked back to the stage. He felt panic rising. This was impossible. He could not do this. The musicians waited. Richter waited. Marcus looked at all their faces, and then he made a decision. He could not conduct this symphony. He could not fix it by ear, but maybe he did not have to. Maybe the music he had written on the page was enough. Maybe he had to trust that all his knowledge, all his years of experience, all his careful work had been correct. Continue, Marcus said to Richter. Play the second movement. I will watch and take notes. They played on. Marcus watched instead of listened. He watched the bow movements of the string players. He watched the breathing of the wind players. He watched Richter's conducting. And slowly he began to see the music even if he could not hear it. He began to trust what he had written. The rehearsal lasted 3 hours. When it ended, the musicians were exhausted. The music was difficult and demanding. Some of them looked frustrated. Others looked intrigued. Marcus could not tell what they thought. He thanked them and left quickly. Outside the concert hall, Marcus leaned against a wall. His hands were shaking. Had it sounded good? Had it been terrible? He honestly did not know. He had written a symphony that he might never be able to judge with his own ears. It was the strangest, most frightening thing he had ever done. But there was no turning back now. In 2 weeks, they would perform it for an audience. The critics would be there. Schmidt would be there. All of Vienna would hear what the deaf composer had created. And Marcus would stand there, unable to hear his own work, waiting to learn whether he had created something beautiful or made a fool of himself one final time. The rehearsals continued over the next 2 weeks. Marcus attended everyone, though each was torture in its own way. He could not hear the music properly. He could only watch and hope that what he had written on the page was being played correctly. The musicians grew more comfortable with the unusual music, but they also grew more puzzled. During the second rehearsal, Josef Kramer stopped playing in the middle of the third movement. Forgive me, Herr Heilmann, he said, but this passage makes no sense. You have written for the strings to play against the rhythm of the winds. It sounds chaotic. Marcus had expected this too. It is supposed to sound chaotic, he said. Life is chaotic. Why should music always be orderly? Kramer frowned but continued playing. After the rehearsal, Marcus heard him speaking to another violinist. Either Heilmann is a genius or he has gone mad, Kramer said. I cannot tell which. The comment hurt, but Marcus understood it. His music was different from what people expected. It did not follow the traditional rules. It was rough where it was supposed to be smooth. It was harsh where it was supposed to be gentle, but that was because Marcus was writing from a different place now. He was not trying to please audiences or impress critics. He was trying to express something true. Between rehearsals, Marcus went back to his apartment and made notes. He could not hear the orchestra properly, but he could see things. He noticed when a section looked confused about their entrance. He saw when the balance seemed wrong by watching how hard musicians had to play. He developed new ways of understanding his music without hearing it. Richter, the conductor, was patient and helpful. He came to Marcus's apartment several times to discuss the score. Help me understand what you want, Richter would say. Explain the feeling you want each section to create. Marcus would try to put into words what he could not express in sounds. Richter listened carefully and then translated Marcus's words into instructions for the orchestra. The second movement should feel like a conversation between old friends, Marcus told Richter. The instruments should pass themes back and forth gently like people sharing memories. And the third movement? Richter asked. A storm, Marcus said. Not just any storm. An internal storm. The kind that happens in your mind when everything you believed is questioned. Richter nodded. He was beginning to understand. This symphony was not just music. It was Marcus's story. It was about struggle and doubt. It was about losing something precious and finding new ways to continue. It was about facing silence and refusing to be silenced. As the rehearsals progressed, something interesting began to happen. The musicians who had been frustrated or confused started to change their minds. It happened slowly, almost person by person. First, it was a young cellist who approached Marcus after rehearsal. Herr Heilmann, she said shyly, I think I understand now. The cello part in the fourth movement. It is not trying to be beautiful. It is trying to be honest. Then it was a horn player. The way you have written the brass, he told Marcus. It is not like fanfares in other symphonies. It is more raw, more human. Even Kramer, the skeptical concertmaster, began to soften. During the fifth rehearsal, he played a particularly difficult violin solo in the second movement. When he finished, he looked up at Marcus with surprise on his face. I felt something just now, Kramer said. I felt what you were trying to say. Marcus felt a small spark of hope. Maybe the music was working. Maybe what he had written while deaf was somehow communicating what he wanted to say. But there was still the performance to worry about. And the critics. And Schmidt, Frau Weber, noticed that Marcus was sleeping poorly. You must rest, she told him. You will make yourself sick. I cannot rest, Marcus said. There is too much to worry about. What is the worst thing that can happen? Frau Weber asked. Marcus thought about it. They could hate it. Schmidt could write another terrible review. My career could be finished forever. Your career is already finished, Frau Weber said bluntly. You have been hiding in this apartment for a year. You have nothing left to lose, but you have everything to gain. If the symphony is good, you have your life back. If it is not good, you are no worse off than you are now. Her words were harsh but true. Marcus had been acting as if he still had a reputation to protect, but he did not. He had already lost everything. This performance was not a risk. It was a chance. The night before the final rehearsal, Marcus could not sleep at all. He lay in bed thinking about everything that had happened. 2 years ago, he had been celebrated. 1 year ago, he had been humiliated. And now he was about to put his music before the world again. But this time was different. This time, he was not trying to impress anyone. He was just trying to be true to what the music demanded. The final rehearsal went better than any before. The orchestra had practiced the symphony so many times that they knew it by heart. They no longer struggled with the unusual rhythms or strange harmonies. They played with confidence and feeling. Marcus stood at the side of the stage watching. He could barely hear them, but he could see them. And what he saw gave him hope. The musicians were not just playing notes. They were invested in the music. They cared about it. After the rehearsal ended, Richter gathered everyone together. Tomorrow night, he told the orchestra, we will be performing something special. I know this music has been difficult. I know it is not what you are used to, but I believe it is important. I believe Herr Heilmann has written something that people will remember. The musicians applauded. Some of them looked at Marcus and smiled. He felt tears sting his eyes. These people believed in his music. After months of working alone, doubting himself, wondering if he was deluding himself, other people believed in what he had created. That evening, Count von Esterwald came to visit. He brought good news and bad news. The good news was that the concert was completely sold out. Every seat was filled. The bad news was that it was sold out because word had spread that the disgraced composer was making a comeback. People were coming to see if he would fail again. Some were hoping he would succeed. Others were expecting disaster. It would be the social event of the season. "I am sorry, Marcus," the Count said. "I tried to keep it small. But once people heard about it, I could not control who came." Marcus felt sick to his stomach. "How many critics?" he asked. 7 major critics, the Count admitted, including Schmidt, of course, but also Herr Wagner from Berlin and Madame Rousseau from Paris. This has become more than a local concert. People are traveling to Vienna just to hear it. Marcus sat down heavily. Why do they care so much?" "Because you are a story," the Count said. "The young genius who fell from grace. Everyone wants to know what happens next. Do you rise again or do you disappear completely? It is dramatic." "My life is not a play," Marcus said bitterly. "No," the Count agreed. "But to the outside world it looks like one. You cannot control what people think or why they come. You can only control the music. And the music, Marcus, is extraordinary. I heard the rehearsal today. It is unlike anything I have ever heard. It is powerful and strange and moving. Let that be enough." Marcus wanted to believe him, but doubt still gnawed at him. What if the Count was wrong? What if the music only seemed good to him because he was Marcus's friend? What if tomorrow night, when a real audience heard it, they would recognize it for what it truly was? The confused scribblings of a deaf man who could no longer judge his own work. The Count seemed to read his thoughts. "Marcus," he said firmly, "I am not a musician, but I know art. I have been collecting art and supporting artists for 30 years. I can recognize when something is genuine and when something is false. Your symphony is genuine. It comes from a real place. That is what makes it powerful. Trust yourself." After the Count left, Marcus walked to his piano. He sat down and placed his hands on the keys. He could barely hear the notes anymore, but he could feel them. He played the opening theme of his symphony. The melody flowed through his fingers into the keys, into the strings inside the piano, into the wooden case, into his hands pressed against the wood. He felt it more than heard it. And feeling it, he remembered why he had written it. This symphony was not about impressing critics. It was not about reviving his career. It was about survival. It was about finding a way to continue making music even when music itself was being taken away from him. It was about proving that art could exist even in silence, that beauty could live even in loss. Marcus went to bed that night feeling calmer than he had in days. Whatever happened tomorrow, he had done something important. He had finished his symphony. He had not given up. He had not let deafness defeat him. That was already a victory, no matter what the critics said. The morning of the performance arrived. Marcus woke early. The ringing in his ears seemed louder than ever, as if his body was reminding him of what he had lost. He dressed carefully in his best clothes, the same clothes he had worn for his debut performance 5 years ago. They were a little worn now, a little faded, but they still fit. Frau Weber came to help him prepare. She fussed over his hair and made sure his collar was straight. "You look very handsome," she said. "Very distinguished." "I look terrified," Marcus said. "That too," she admitted with a smile. "But terror looks good on artists. It means you care." Marcus arrived at the concert hall 3 hours before the performance. The building was buzzing with activity. Ushers were preparing the seating. The orchestra members were warming up backstage. The hall manager was checking every detail. Marcus felt like he was watching everything from far away, as if it was happening to someone else. Richter found him standing alone in the hallway. "How are you feeling?" the conductor asked. "Like I might be sick," Marcus said honestly. "Good," Richter said. "The great performers are always nervous. It means the performance matters." They went through the score one last time, checking details. Richter had marked his copy with notes from all the rehearsals. He knew exactly how Marcus wanted each section to sound. "I will conduct it as if you were standing next to me, telling me what to do," Richter promised. "I will be standing to the side of the stage," Marcus said. "I cannot sit in the audience. I need to see the orchestra." Of course, Richter said. This is your symphony. You should be where you are comfortable. As the afternoon wore on, people began to arrive. Marcus watched from backstage as the audience filed in. He recognized many faces. Important composers, wealthy patrons, society women in expensive dresses, and the critics. He saw them take their seats in the front rows, notebooks already open, pens ready. And there, in the third row, was Herr Schmidt, the man who had destroyed Marcus's career with a single review. He sat calmly, his face showing nothing. Marcus felt a mixture of anger and fear. This man had so much power. One word from him could make or break a composer's career, and he had chosen to break Marcus. But then Marcus thought about what the Count had said. He had nothing left to lose. Schmidt had already written his worst. What more could he do? The thought was oddly freeing. The orchestra took their positions on stage. The audience slowly quieted. Marcus stood in the wings, just out of sight. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Richter walked onto the stage. The audience applauded. The conductor took his place at the podium and raised his baton. For a long moment, everything was still. The entire hall held its breath. Marcus closed his eyes. He could not hear what was about to happen, but he could hope. He could pray. He could believe that the music he had written in silence would speak to people who could still hear. Richter's baton came down. The orchestra began to play, and Marcus's symphony, born from loss and finished in deafness, began to fill the concert hall. Marcus opened his eyes and watched. He watched the violinist's bows move across the strings. He watched the wind players' fingers dancing on their instruments. He watched the percussionist waiting patiently for his entrance. He watched Richter conducting, his whole body moving with the music, bringing Marcus's vision to life. Marcus could hear almost nothing. Just distant, muffled sounds that could have been anything. But he could see. He could see the intensity on the musicians' faces. He could see the audience sitting very still, leaning forward in their seats. He could see that something was happening. Something important. The first movement ended. There was a brief pause. Then the second movement began, gentler and more lyrical. Marcus watched a woman in the fifth row wipe her eyes. He saw a man in the balcony close his eyes, lost in the music. He saw the critics writing notes, their faces thoughtful rather than dismissive. The symphony continued. The third movement was the storm Marcus had written, full of conflict and chaos. The fourth movement built slowly to its conclusion, growing from whisper quiet to thunderously loud, then ending with a single, soft note that faded into silence. The final note died away. For a moment, no one moved. The hall was absolutely silent. Marcus held his breath. This was the moment. This was when he would know if his symphony had worked or failed. He waited for the judgment of the audience, unable to hear but desperately hoping that what he had created in silence would speak to those who could still hear. The silence lasted for what felt like an eternity. Marcus stood in the wings watching the audience. No one moved. No one spoke. The orchestra members sat with their instruments, waiting. Richter stood at the podium, his baton still raised. Everyone seemed frozen in time. Then slowly Count von Esterwald stood up. He began to clap. The sound was faint to Marcus like distant thunder, but he could see the Count's hands moving together, and he could see the expression on his friend's face. The Count was not just being polite. There were tears running down his cheeks. One by one, other people began to stand. They stood and applauded. More and more people rose from their seats. The woman Marcus had seen crying was on her feet, clapping enthusiastically. The man from the balcony was standing, applauding. All around the concert hall, people were rising. Marcus felt dizzy. He could barely hear the applause, but he could see it. He could see hundreds of hands moving, hundreds of faces turned toward the stage. Some people were wiping their eyes, others were smiling. The orchestra members were standing now too, turning to bow to the audience. And then Marcus saw something that shocked him. Herr Schmidt, the critic who had destroyed him, was standing. He was not just standing. He was applauding. And there were tears on his face too. Schmidt, who Marcus thought hated him, who had called him finished, was crying. Richter turned to the wings and gestured for Marcus to come out. Marcus shook his head. He did not want to face the audience. He was terrified. But Richter gestured again, more insistently. The orchestra members were looking toward the wings, clapping. They wanted him to come out. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The audience saw him, and the applause seemed to grow louder, though he could barely hear it. He could see mouths opening, people cheering. The vibration of all that noise came through the stage floor into his feet. He felt it in his bones. Marcus bowed awkwardly. He was not used to this anymore. He had spent so long hiding, so long in shame, that he had forgotten what success felt like. The applause continued. People did not sit down. They kept standing, kept clapping. Marcus counted in his head. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. The ovation went on and on. Finally, slowly, the audience began to sit. The applause faded. But people were still talking excitedly to each other. Marcus could see animated conversations happening all over the hall. He bowed again and quickly left the stage. Backstage, his hands were shaking so badly he had to sit down. The orchestra members came off stage, gathering around him. They were talking all at once, excited and emotional. Marcus could not hear what they were saying, but he could see their faces. Kramer, the concertmaster who had been so skeptical, grasped Marcus's hand firmly. His lips moved, and though Marcus could not hear the words, he understood the sentiment. Richter was the last to come backstage. The young conductor's face was flushed with emotion. He embraced Marcus tightly. "Did you feel that?" he shouted, knowing Marcus could not hear well. "Did you feel what happened in that hall?" Marcus nodded. He had felt it. Even without hearing, he had felt the power of the music reaching people. He had seen it on their faces. He had felt it in the way they stood and applauded. Something he had created in silence had moved people who could hear. Count von Esterwald pushed through the crowd backstage. He was laughing and crying at the same time. Marcus, it was magnificent. I have never seen a response like that, never." People were crowding around now. Audience members had come backstage to congratulate Marcus personally. He was surrounded by faces, by mouths moving, by hands reaching out to shake his. It was overwhelming. He felt grateful and terrified and exhausted all at once. Then the crowd parted and Herr Schmidt appeared. Marcus's body tensed. This was the man who had ruined him. This was the critic whose words had destroyed his career and his confidence. Schmidt stood there, his notebook in his hand, looking at Marcus. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Schmidt did something unexpected. He bowed deeply to Marcus. When he straightened up, Marcus could see that the critic's eyes were still wet with tears. Schmidt opened his mouth to speak, but Marcus could not hear him. The critic realized this. He pulled out his notebook and wrote something quickly. Then he tore out the page and handed it to Marcus. Marcus read the note. It said, "I was wrong about you. Tonight you have shown all of Vienna what a true artist is. I am humbled and grateful to have heard this symphony. Thank you for not giving up." Marcus looked up at Schmidt. The critic was waiting for a response. Marcus did not know what to say. Part of him wanted to be angry. Part of him wanted to throw Schmidt's apology back in his face. But standing there, after what had just happened, Marcus found he did not have room for anger anymore. He nodded to Schmidt and shook his hand. The critic wrote something else and handed it to Marcus. "May I interview you tomorrow? I want to write about your symphony and your journey. I want to tell your story properly." Marcus hesitated, then nodded again. Schmidt bowed once more and left. Marcus watched him go, feeling strangely empty of the resentment he had carried for so long. The celebration backstage lasted for hours. People did not want to leave. They wanted to talk about the music, to congratulate Marcus, to bask in what they had just experienced. Finally, Count von Esterwald rescued Marcus from the crowd. "You need rest," the Count said. "You have given everything tonight. Come, I will take you home." In the Count's carriage, riding through the dark streets of Vienna, Marcus felt like he was in a dream. Had it really happened? Had his symphony actually succeeded? It seemed impossible. "It was not just good, Marcus," the Count said, reading his thoughts. "It was extraordinary. People will be talking about tonight for years. You have created something new, something that has never existed before. But I could not hear it, Marcus said. I still do not know what it really sounded like. Then I will tell you, the Count said. It sounded like truth. It sounded like a man who has suffered and survived. It sounded like music freed from the need to be pretty or pleasing. It sounded like your heart on display. And that is why people responded the way they did. They heard something real. When they reached Marcus's apartment, Frau Weber was waiting up for him. She had heard about the triumph from neighbors who had been at the concert. She hugged him tightly, something she had never done before. I knew, she said. I knew it would be wonderful. I am so proud of you, Herr Heilmann. Marcus went to bed that night exhausted but unable to sleep. His mind kept replaying everything. The audience standing, Schmidt crying, the orchestra's dedication, the feeling of the applause vibrating through the stage. He had gone from disgrace to triumph in one evening. It did not seem real. The next morning, Schmidt came to visit as promised. He brought several newspapers with him. These are the early reviews, he said, speaking slowly so Marcus could try to read his lips. But I wanted to speak with you before I write mine. They sat in Marcus's study, the same room where he had spent months working in isolation. Schmidt asked questions. He wanted to know when Marcus had started losing his hearing. He wanted to know how Marcus had composed without being able to hear properly. He wanted to know about the despair and the decision to continue anyway. Marcus answered as honestly as he could. He explained about feeling the vibrations, about using mathematics and memory, about writing from his heart instead of his ears, about the dark nights when he wanted to give up, about the determination to finish what he had started. Schmidt wrote everything down carefully. When he finished, he looked at Marcus with something like awe. You have done something no one thought was possible, he said. You have created great music without the ability to hear it. You have turned your greatest loss into your greatest strength. I do not know about that, Marcus said. I only know I could not stop. Music is who I am. Taking away my hearing does not change that. Schmidt's review appeared in the newspaper the next day. Frau Weber read it aloud to Marcus. It was completely different from the review Schmidt had written a year earlier. This time he praised Marcus in the highest terms. He called the symphony a revelation and a new direction for music. He wrote about Marcus's deafness and how it had somehow made his music more powerful, more direct, more emotional. He ended by writing, Herr Heilmann's critics, myself chief among them, owe him not just an apology but our gratitude. He has shown us that music is not just sound. It is something deeper. It is the human soul expressing itself. And last night we heard a soul that refused to be silenced. The other reviews were similarly positive. Critics from Berlin and Paris wrote about how Marcus's symphony was revolutionary. They said it pointed toward a new way of thinking about music. Word spread quickly. Within days, everyone in Europe's music world was talking about Marcus Heilmann's comeback. But the most important response came from other composers. They wanted to study Marcus's symphony. They wanted to understand how he had achieved what he had achieved. Young composers wrote to him asking for advice. Established composers came to Vienna to meet him. Marcus, who had been isolated and forgotten, suddenly found himself at the center of attention again. The Imperial Court Orchestra asked to perform the symphony again. Then other orchestras requested the score. Within a month, performances were scheduled in Berlin, Paris, and London. Marcus's symphony was traveling across Europe, touching audiences everywhere. But success brought new challenges. Concert halls wanted Marcus to write more. They offered him commissions and money. Audiences wanted to hear his new works. Critics wondered if he could repeat his success. The pressure was enormous. Marcus felt overwhelmed. He had poured everything into the symphony. It had taken him years to write. He was not sure he had another work like that inside him. And there was a deeper fear. What if the symphony's success was a fluke? What if he could not create anything good again? He shared these fears with Richter during one of the conductor's visits. I understand, Richter said. But you cannot think that way. You did not write the symphony to be successful. You wrote it because you had to. Keep doing that. Write what you must write and let the rest take care of itself. Marcus knew Richter was right, but knowing something and feeling it were different things. He sat at his desk, staring at blank manuscript paper, feeling paralyzed. What should he write? What could follow the symphony? One evening, Frau Weber found him sitting in the dark, not working. "What is wrong?" she asked. "I do not know what to write next," Marcus admitted. "Everyone expects another masterpiece. What if I cannot deliver?" Frau Weber sat down across from him. "Do you remember what you told me months ago? You said music is who you are. That has not changed. Stop worrying about what people expect. Write what wants to be written." Her words echoed what Richter had said. Marcus realized he was falling into an old trap. He was writing for others instead of for himself. He was trying to please critics instead of expressing truth. That was what had led to his first failure. Marcus made a decision. He would not force himself to write another symphony immediately. Instead, he would experiment. He would write smaller pieces. He would try new things. He would allow himself to fail in private before succeeding in public. He started with a piano sonata. Just him and the piano, the instrument he knew best. He wrote a piece that was personal and intimate. It was about the experience of going deaf, about loss and adaptation. He did not write it for anyone else. He wrote it for himself. When it was finished, he showed it to Richter. The conductor played it on Marcus's piano while Marcus watched and felt the vibrations. "It is beautiful," Richter said. "Different from the symphony. More personal, but just as powerful. Should we perform it?" Marcus asked. "Yes," Richter said, "but in a small venue. Not a huge concert hall. Somewhere intimate where people can really listen." They arranged a recital in a small salon. Only 50 people attended. No critics were invited. It was just music lovers and friends. Richter played the sonata while Marcus sat in the audience. He could not hear it well, but he could see the faces of the listeners. He could see them responding to the music, and that was enough. Word spread about the sonata. People who heard it talked about it. Critics heard about it and wanted to review it. But Marcus refused to have it performed publicly yet. "It is not ready," he told the Count. "I am not ready. I need time to find my voice again." The Count understood. He protected Marcus from the demands of the public. He turned down commissions and requests. He gave Marcus the space he needed to work at his own pace. Over the following months, Marcus wrote several more pieces. Some were good, some were not. He was learning to compose in his new reality, finding his way in silence. Sometimes it was frustrating. Sometimes he felt lost. But he kept working, kept experimenting, kept pushing forward. One afternoon, Marcus received a letter. It was from a young composer in Prague who was also losing his hearing. The composer wrote about his despair, his fear that his career was over. He had heard about Marcus's triumph and wanted to know how Marcus had done it. How had he continued composing while deaf? Marcus sat down and wrote a long reply. He told the young composer about the dark times, about the temptation to give up, about the techniques he had developed, about learning to trust himself. He ended the letter with these words: "Deafness has taken my hearing, but it cannot take my music. Music lives in the mind and the heart, not just the ears. Trust yourself. Trust the music inside you. It will find a way out, even through silence." Sending that letter, Marcus realized something. His greatest work was not just the symphony he had written. It was the example he had set. He had shown other musicians that disability was not the end, that art could survive even terrible loss, that determination and creativity could overcome almost any obstacle. Marcus thought back to the night of the premiere, to the standing ovation he could barely hear, to Schmidt's tears, to the feeling of the applause vibrating through the stage. That night had changed his life. But more importantly, it had changed what he believed was possible. And if it had changed what he believed was possible, maybe it could do the same for others. He returned to his desk and picked up his pen. There was still so much music inside him waiting to be written. His hearing was nearly gone now. Soon it might be completely silent. But Marcus was no longer afraid. He had proven that music could exist beyond sound. Now he would spend the rest of his life exploring what that meant. 5 years had passed since the triumphant premiere of Marcus's symphony. Vienna was a different place now, and so was Marcus. He was 33 years old and completely deaf. The world was silent to him. But his life was louder than it had ever been. Marcus had become famous across Europe. His symphony had been performed in every major city. Other composers studied his work, trying to understand his unique approach to composition. Music students traveled to Vienna hoping to meet him. He received letters from all over the world. Some were from admirers. Others were from musicians facing their own struggles, looking for hope in his story. His apartment had changed too. He had moved to a larger place with better light and more room for work. The walls were covered with manuscript paper. The shelves overflowed with scores and books. 2 pianos sat in his study now, along with a long table where he could spread out orchestral parts. It looked like the workspace of a busy, successful composer, which is exactly what Marcus had become. But success had not been easy or simple. After the premiere, Marcus had struggled to find his voice again. For months he had written small pieces, experimenting with different styles. Some worked, some did not. He learned to accept failure as part of the creative process. Not everything had to be a masterpiece. Sometimes you had to write bad music to discover good music. Slowly, piece by piece, Marcus had built a new body of work. He wrote piano sonatas that explored the experience of silence. He wrote string quartets that focused on texture and rhythm rather than melody. He wrote pieces that were strange and difficult, that challenged both performers and audiences. Not everyone liked his music. Some critics found it too harsh, too unconventional, but others recognized that Marcus was creating something genuinely new. The most important thing that had changed was Marcus himself. He was no longer afraid. He had faced his greatest fear and survived it. He had lost his hearing and continued anyway. That experience had taught him something valuable. He was stronger than he thought, more resilient, more capable. Deafness had not defeated him. In some ways, it had freed him. Marcus no longer worried about what critics thought. He no longer tried to write music that would please everyone. He wrote what he needed to write, what felt true to him. If people liked it, that was wonderful. If they did not, he could accept that too. This freedom had made him a better composer. His music was more honest now, more direct, more powerful. On a cold morning in December, Marcus sat in his study working on a new piece. It was a choral work, a setting of ancient poetry about human endurance. He was writing for voices he could not hear, imagining how words and music would blend together. It was challenging work, but he had learned to trust his instincts and his knowledge. There was a knock at his door. Marcus felt it through the vibrations in the floor. He got up and opened it. Standing there was Kramer, the violinist who had been so skeptical during the rehearsals of his symphony 5 years ago. Kramer had become a friend since then. He visited Marcus regularly to discuss music and play through new compositions. Marcus gestured for Kramer to come in. They communicated through a mixture of lip reading, written notes, and gestures. They had developed their own system over the years. Kramer pulled out a letter and handed it to Marcus. "This came to the orchestra," Kramer had written on the paper. "I thought you should see it." Marcus read the letter. It was from a music academy in Leipzig. They wanted Marcus to come teach composition. They were offering him a permanent position with a generous salary. They wanted him to train the next generation of composers. The letter praised his innovative approach and said that his unique perspective would be invaluable to students. Marcus set down the letter and looked at Kramer. The violinist was watching him carefully, waiting for his reaction. Marcus picked up a pen and wrote, "What do you think I should do?" Kramer wrote back, "I think you should consider it seriously. You have so much to teach, and many young composers are trying to imitate your style without understanding it. You could show them the real thing." Marcus had been thinking about teaching lately. He received so many letters from young musicians asking for advice. He answered what he could, but letters were limited. Teaching in person would allow him to really help people, to pass on what he had learned not just about music, but about perseverance and creativity in the face of hardship. But teaching would mean less time for composing. It would mean responsibilities and schedules. It would mean leaving Vienna, the city that had been both cruel and kind to him. Marcus was not sure he was ready for such a big change. He wrote to Kramer, "I need time to think about it." Kramer nodded and wrote, "Of course, but do not take too long. This is a good opportunity." After Kramer left, Marcus sat alone with the letter. He thought about his journey. 5 years ago, he had been hiding in a small apartment, convinced his life was over. Now he had opportunities he never imagined. How had that happened? What had changed? The answer, Marcus realized, was not in what had changed externally. It was what had changed inside him. He had learned to see his deafness not as an ending but as a transformation. Yes, he had lost something precious. But he had also gained something. A new way of understanding music, a deeper connection to its essence, a freedom from caring too much about others' opinions. Marcus thought about the young composer in Prague he had written 2 years ago. That composer was now successfully performing his own works despite his hearing loss. Marcus had received a letter from him just last month, thanking Marcus for the encouragement that had kept him going. That letter had meant more to Marcus than any positive review. Maybe teaching was the next step. Maybe it was time to share what he had learned more directly. Marcus picked up his pen and began to write a reply to the academy in Leipzig. Over the next few weeks, Marcus made arrangements to visit Leipzig. He wanted to see the academy, meet the faculty, understand what teaching there would actually involve. The trip was exhausting. Traveling while deaf was complicated. He could not hear announcements at train stations. He could not easily ask for help. But he had learned to manage. He carried a notebook everywhere, writing questions when he needed to communicate. The academy in Leipzig was impressive. It had excellent facilities and dedicated students. The faculty welcomed Marcus warmly. They showed him the teaching studios and the concert hall. They introduced him to students who were excited about the possibility of studying with him. One young woman, a composition student named Anna, told Marcus through written notes that his symphony had changed her life. It had shown her that music could be more than just entertainment. It could be art that mattered, that said important things about human experience. Marcus was moved by her words. He realized that his work had reached people in ways he had never expected. His symphony was not just music anymore. It had become a symbol of perseverance and artistic integrity. People saw in it proof that you could overcome terrible obstacles and create something beautiful. After several days in Leipzig, Marcus made his decision. He would accept the teaching position, but only part-time. He would spend half the year teaching in Leipzig and half the year composing in Vienna. The academy agreed to this arrangement. They understood that Marcus needed time for his own work. Returning to Vienna, Marcus felt both excited and nervous about this new chapter. He was 33 years old and embarking on a completely different kind of life. But then again, his entire adult life had been about adaptation and change. Why should this be any different? Marcus threw himself into preparation for teaching. He organized his thoughts about composition into a clear system. He thought about the mistakes he had made as a young composer and how to help students avoid them. He developed exercises that would help students understand music structurally, not just by ear. This would be useful for all students, not just those with hearing problems. In the spring, Marcus began teaching at Leipzig. His first class had 12 students, all advanced composition students. They were curious about him, about his methods, about how he composed while deaf. Marcus addressed this directly in the first class. Through written materials he had prepared in advance, he told them, "I am deaf. This is a fact. But it is not the most important fact about me. The most important fact is that I am a composer. I do not compose despite being deaf. I compose because I am a composer. That is who I am. Deafness is simply the condition under which I work. You all have conditions under which you work. Some have more time, some have less. Some have good pianos, some have bad ones. Some have supportive families, some do not. We all work with what we have. My condition is that I cannot hear, but I have learned to work with that." The students were attentive and respectful. They wanted to learn from him. Marcus found that he enjoyed teaching more than he expected. There was something satisfying about helping young composers find their voices. He was tough but fair, demanding excellence while being patient with mistakes. One student reminded Marcus of himself at that age. His name was Thomas, and he was brilliant but insecure. He wrote beautiful music but constantly doubted himself. He would write something wonderful, then cross it out, convinced it was not good enough. Marcus recognized this pattern immediately. It was the same trap he had fallen into before his deafness. Marcus worked closely with Thomas. He pushed him to trust his instincts. He made him defend his musical choices, forcing him to articulate why he made the decisions he made. Slowly, Thomas grew more confident. By the end of the term, he had completed a string quartet that was genuinely innovative and impressive. "How did you know how to help me?" Thomas wrote in a note to Marcus. Marcus wrote back, "Because I was you. I doubted myself constantly. I thought every piece had to be perfect. But perfection is the enemy of art. Art needs to be alive and real, not perfect." Teaching gave Marcus new insights into his own work. Explaining composition to others forced him to understand his own process better. He began to see patterns in what he did, to understand his own methods more clearly. This understanding fed back into his composing, making him even more effective. During his time in Vienna, Marcus continued to compose prolifically. He wrote 2 more symphonies, several chamber works, and numerous piano pieces. Each work was different, exploring new territory. He was not trying to repeat the success of his first symphony. He was pushing forward, always experimenting, always growing. His second symphony was very different from the first. Where the first had been about struggle and triumph, the second was about acceptance and peace. It was quieter, more introspective. Some critics did not like it as much as the first symphony. They wanted more drama, more intensity, but Marcus did not care. He was writing what needed to be written, not what people expected. Years passed. Marcus's reputation continued to grow. He was now considered one of the most important composers in Europe. His music was performed regularly. His students went on to successful careers, carrying forward the lessons he had taught them. Several of them became important composers in their own right, but Marcus remained humble. He never forgot where he had come from. He remembered the poverty of his childhood. He remembered the humiliation of his failed performance. He remembered the dark days when he thought his life was over. Those memories kept him grounded, kept him grateful for what he had. On Marcus's 40th birthday, Count von Esterwald organized a celebration. It was held in the same concert hall where Marcus's symphony had premiered 12 years earlier. The Imperial Court Orchestra performed several of Marcus's works. Students from Leipzig came to celebrate with their teacher. Kramer and the other orchestra members who had worked with Marcus over the years were there. Even Schmidt, the critic, attended. After the concert, people gathered around Marcus. They wanted to congratulate him, to thank him, to tell him what his music meant to them. Marcus could not hear their words, but he could see their faces. He could see the emotion in their eyes. And he understood. At one point, Schmidt approached with a young man. Schmidt wrote a note introducing him. The young man was Schmidt's nephew, also a music critic. Schmidt wrote, "I have told him your story many times. About how I was wrong about you. About how you proved that true artistry comes from the soul, not the ears. You taught me to listen differently. Thank you for that lesson." Marcus was moved. He thought back to the devastating review Schmidt had written all those years ago. At the time, it had felt like the end of the world. But in a strange way, it had been necessary. If he had continued being successful, would he have pushed himself to grow? Would he have discovered the deeper understanding of music that deafness had forced him to find? Late that night, after everyone had gone home, Marcus stood alone on the stage of the concert hall. The building was dark and empty. He could not hear the silence, but he could feel it. He thought about the journey that had brought him here. From that terrified 28-year-old whose world was collapsing, to this moment standing in triumph. Marcus had learned something important. Life did not always go as planned. Sometimes you lost things you thought were essential. Sometimes you failed in public. Sometimes your worst fears came true, but none of that meant it was over. Loss could be transformed into something else. Failure could be a beginning rather than an ending. Fear could be faced and overcome. The critics had laughed when they heard he could not hear. They thought a deaf composer was impossible, a joke, a tragedy. But Marcus had proven them wrong. He had shown that music was bigger than sound. It was mathematics and emotion and structure and soul. It was something that existed in the mind and heart before it ever reached the ears. Marcus walked to the piano on stage. He sat down and placed his hands on the keys. He could not hear the notes he played, but he felt them. They vibrated through his fingers, up his arms, into his chest. This was his music now, felt rather than heard, but still music, still art, still beautiful. He played the opening theme of his first symphony, the melody that had announced his return to the musical world, the theme that had silenced the critics and proven that a deaf man could compose. He played it slowly, feeling each note, remembering the triumph and the struggle that had created it. When he finished, Marcus stood up and looked out at the empty concert hall. If anyone had been there to see him, they would have seen him smile. Not a sad smile or a bitter smile, a smile of genuine contentment. Marcus Heilmann had lost his hearing, but he had found something more valuable. He had found himself. He had found his true voice as an artist. And that voice speaking through silence had changed the world of music forever. The critics had laughed. They had said a deaf composer was impossible. But Marcus had proven that nothing is impossible if you refuse to give up. That art finds a way, even through the darkest silence. That the human spirit, when tested, reveals strengths no one knew existed. Years later, when Marcus was an old man, students would ask him about that night. The night his symphony premiered, the night everything changed. They would ask what the secret was. How did he do it? Marcus would always give the same answer. He would write it out carefully so everyone could understand. There was no secret. I simply refused to let silence silence me. Music is not just something you hear. It is something you are, and no one can take that away from you unless you let them. I did not let them. That is all. And that, in the end, was the truth. Marcus Heilmann had faced the worst thing that could happen to a composer, and had emerged stronger. His music lived on, performed and studied for generations. But more than his music, his story lived on. The story of the deaf composer who refused to be defeated. The story of the man who turned loss into triumph. The story that proved the critics wrong and showed the world what was possible. The concert hall was dark now. Marcus walked to the door and looked back one last time. This place had been the scene of his greatest failure and his greatest success. Both had been necessary.